All right, good morning, everybody. Wanted to give folks a second to hop on the call here. My name is Karthik. I'll be with you this morning for Real Estate Principles, Chapter 13. Want to welcome everybody for being on the call today. We'll jump right into the deck here. Schedule's calling for Chapter 13 today. So a couple of things that I would write. First, on page 378, underneath where it says appraisal licensing, I would write three words. I'd write the words good one day. So, because this is on the test, but not in the book, an appraiser intends that the estimate of value as disclosed in the appraisal report only be good for one day. So appraisals are only good for one day. Now, I know what you might be thinking. You might say to yourself, no, this isn't true. I refinanced my house and the bank took a 2-week-old appraisal or a 3-week-old appraisal. When I say an appraisal is only good for one day, I'm not referring to how long a bank will accept the appraisal. I'm referring to how long an appraiser is liable for some error or omission on the appraisal report. So, for example, let's say an appraiser goes out to your house today and says that your house is worth $600,000. Tomorrow, the city announces they're going to put a big nuclear dump right across the street from your home. Your house is no longer worth $600,000, but it's not like the appraiser has to go out and redo the appraisal. The appraisal is good for how long? One day, right? So first question you'll find on the test, number one, an appraiser intends that the estimate of value be disclosed and valid only for one day. The second thing you might want to make a note of is that, again, I write the word estimate or opinion. All an appraisal is an estimate or opinion of value. An appraisal is not some written guarantee of what a property will sell for. I mean, isn't it true? You could have 3 different appraisers go out to your house. All 3 look at the same set of data, yet all 3 come back with slightly different opinions of value. That's absolutely true. And we'll talk about why that is this morning. But 2 things just to get us started. Number one, how long is an appraisal valid for? 1 day. And number 2, true or false, an appraisal is a written guarantee of what a property will sell for. False. It's only an estimate or opinion of value. Now, page 380 in the 11th edition, let's talk about appraiser licensing and how to get an appraisal license in California. Now, notice there's actually 4 different appraisal levels in California. They are, and you'll see these in the book, they are the trainee license, the residential license, the certified residential, and the certified general. Now, I want to be clear that this is not how real estate licensing works. As a real estate agent, there is no rule that says that you have to have a certain level of experience to sell a home that's over 10 million or 1 million. The first day you get your real estate license, you can sell a $25 million commercial building day one in California. As an appraiser, this is not the case. As an appraiser, first, everyone starts as a trainee. Now, as a trainee, you cannot sign off on any of your own appraisal reports. Every appraisal that you do has to be countersigned by a supervising appraiser. So you cannot act on your own as a trainee. This has to happen for 2,000 hours. So basically, this is 40 hours a week for a full year, right? 40 hours a week, 50 weeks out of the year, there's your 2,000 hours, and that's how you get beyond being a trainee. Once you're finished as a trainee, the next license everyone goes to is the residential license. Now, again, as a residential appraiser, hallelujah, you can act on your own. You don't need a supervising appraiser to countersign any of your appraisals. However, there's a limit on what you can appraise. Residential property, you can appraise up to $1 million. Commercial property, you can appraise up to $250,000. Now, there's not a lot of houses that are under $1 million in like Newport Beach or Beverly Hills or Saratoga. So you're really not going to be appraising the super high end here, but you can make a living as a residential appraiser. How many commercial properties are under 250,000? Basically none. There are no commercial buildings for the most part under $250,000. So you're really not doing commercial appraisals. The next license that everyone moves up to is the certified residential license. Now, as a certified residential appraiser, you could appraise residential property up to any amount. So a $25 million mansion in Bel Air, a $9 million beachfront home in Malibu, you can do those appraisals as a certified residential appraiser. Commercial, though, you're still limited to 250,000. The best license that everybody strives for, especially if you want to do commercial appraisals, is the certified general license. As a certified general appraiser, you can appraise all real estate regardless of size, value, or complexity. So that's the best license that everyone has. But at the end of the day, the certified general license is the one you get if you want to be a commercial appraiser. If you want to do commercial appraisals, you kind of have to have a certified general license. Now, this is not the case for real estate agents. As a real estate agent, you can just have a salesperson's license, put your license under a broker, and literally you can sell $10 million commercial properties, $60 million hotels, $5 million homes with a real estate license. I want to be clear that this is specific to appraisal licensing, not to real estate licensing. So again, 3 questions for the test, then I'll take any questions you might have. Number 1, how long is an appraisal valid for? 1 day only, right? Appraisals are valid for 1 day only, number 1. Number 2, true or false, an appraisal is a written guarantee of what a property will sell for.
False.
False, right? It's just an estimate or opinion of value. And finally, an appraiser is asked to appraise a commercial property with an estimated value of $550,000. What appraisal license must they have? Your answer, they must have a what? Certified general, though, specifically, right? Because it's commercial over 250. Any questions about anything that you have related to appraisal licensing? The next concept really is, well, what is an appraisal? 381 in the 11th edition, an estimate of value. And I don't think that's super complicated. You know that already. An appraisal is an estimate of value. The problem is there are many words that we could put in front of the word value that change the meaning of value. For example, insured value. The insured value of a property is not what an appraiser is looking for. The insured value is just the value of the structure. An appraiser is not only determining the value of the structure, they're determining the value of the structure and the land. So they're not looking for the insured value. They're not looking for the assessed value. The assessed value is only for property tax purposes in California. They're not concerned with subjective value. By the way, you've probably heard that before, that term subjective. What does subjective value mean? So subjective value is value in the mind of the owner. Now, you and I both know that generally people think that their own things are worth more than they really are. So the appraiser is definitely not concerned with the seller's hallucination of value. So the appraiser is not concerned with subjective value. They're not concerned with the assessed value. They're definitely not concerned with the insured value. Appraisers are concerned with market value. In fact, right next to market value, you might want to write 2 words. I'd write the words primary goal. The primary goal of any appraisal is to determine the market value of a property. So the market value is the primary goal of any appraisal. 381 and 382 in the 11th edition, knowing that market value is the primary goal, we should probably just spend a minute or 2 defining what market value is. And in fact, you might want to write 3 things down next to market value. The first thing I'd write next to market value is I'd write the words open market. So for us to determine what the market value is, we have to consider the market as being open. Now, what does open market mean? you might want to write the words biddable by anyone. In a market value transaction, this means that the property is open for purchase by anyone. So like if you and I decide that I'm going to buy your house and it's at 2:15 in the morning in some restaurant in LA and we come up with the price of $2 million, who knows if that truly is market value because it was never exposed to the open market. So for market value to exist, number one, the transaction has to have been open market. Number two, the transaction has to be arm's length. Now, arm's length means that the parties don't have a personal relationship with one another. Arm's length means the buyer and seller are not like related. For example, if you sold your house to your mom, what would you charge your mom for your house? Don't say double. Well, you'd probably give your house to your mom for free or give her, just pay off the loan or here, mom, you can have it, right? Most people anyway. So the appraiser is not asking, hey, what would this guy sell his house privately to his mom for? That's not market value. And then finally, you have to have a willing buyer in bed with a willing seller. A willing buyer in bed with a willing seller. What this means, of course, is that the parties are not acting under duress. You probably heard that term duress before. What does that term duress mean?
Stress.
Or a force.
Under pressure.
Under pressure. For example, if somebody has a job loss, an illness, a death in the family, a foreclosure, do you think that they are going to hold out for top dollar? Probably not. So the point is, the appraiser is not considering what would this guy sell his house privately to his mom for in a divorce scenario. That's not market value. Market value is if anybody can bid on it, the parties who do the deal don't know one another, and neither party is acting under any sort of duress. This is the purest definition of market value. Now, not every deal is this way, but this is the mindset that the appraiser goes into when they do the appraisal. It's not two friends doing a deal privately. It's not some stressed sale. It's what would two people who don't know each other that aren't forced to buy or sell, biddable by the open market, what would they pay? And this is the purest expression of market value. Now, on page 382, you'll see that there are four things that create value. And these four things, what I like about these is you can remember these easily by the acronym DUST, D-U-S-T, and you'll see this term DUST in that gray box. There are four things that create value. Four things that create value. The four things that create value are demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. So these are the four things that create value. Demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. So the first thing that creates value, of course, is demand. Now, what does this mean? This means how many people want a given item. Now, you know, the more demand there is for something, the more valuable it is. Like, watch, how much demand is there for housing right now? There's a lot, right? And this is driven by a lot of things. It's driven by low interest rates. It's given by, you know, a lot of different reasons why there's demand, but there's a lot of demand for houses. Let me ask you this. How much demand is there for a VCR right now?
Not a lot.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you're too young to know what a VCR is, but they used to have these cassettes that people would watch movies on. I mean, there's not really any demand for a VCR except for like people that are into like the vintage space, which is kind of weird. But the point is VCRs are really cheap now. Why? Because there's no demand for it. Utility, the item has to do something. If the item doesn't function, it has no value. There must be some scarcity to the item. Now, what's another term for scarcity? Scarcity is also known as rarity. Obviously, the more rare or scarce something is, what happens to its value? It goes up. Finally, the item has to have the ability to be transferred, meaning there can't be any like weird like liens on the property or any legal challenges to transferring title. It has to be easily transferable. So these four things create value. demand for the item, utility, scarcity, and transferability. Now, for the test, this is an easy one to get right because, of course, of the acronym DUST: demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. Now, I want to show you another term here, 382 with the 11th edition. So see where it says basic value principles. In that paragraph about basic value principles, you'll see a term called gentrification. And this term, gentrification, is an important one. First of all, maybe you've heard of gentrification before. I put the definition here for you in the slide. Gentrification is where values increase due to older and maybe even a more dangerous area having a resurgence. Downtown LA is a classic example of gentrification. Now, if you go back 20 years to 2002 or 2000, and you said you wanted to live in downtown LA, people would say you're freaking nuts. You can go to downtown LA to work, but when the sun sets and the streetlights come on, you kind of got to go home. People weren't living as much. Now, I know there was Bunker Hill and there were apartments in downtown. I get all that, but generally there wasn't a huge residential neighborhood feel to downtown LA. But then what happened? Staples Center opened. The Ritz-Carlton opened. Bottega Louie opened. All these hip, cool restaurants opened. A lot of these warehouse spaces were repurposed into apartments. And all of a sudden now downtown LA is, and for a while there, downtown LA was actually more expensive than Beverly Hills, frankly, on a price per square foot basis. So downtown LA is a classic example of gentrification. Brooklyn, New York has been gentrified. Downtown San Diego has been gentrified. So 2 questions for the test. Number 1, true or false? Gentrification causes values to decrease.
False.
False. Downtown LA has not gotten less expensive. Downtown LA has gotten much more expensive because it's been gentrified. Now, I know some of you on this call might be in other states. Some of you might even be in Northern California, but I'll give you a local example here to Los Angeles. You look at a city like Irvine. Would you say that Irvine has been gentrified? That is, was Irvine once run down, dilapidated, and dangerous, and now there's a resurgence and now it's more expensive?
No.
No, Irvine is not old enough to be gentrified, right? Like Ladera Ranch is not gentrified. Gentrified, again, really means that the neighborhood is basically been run down and maybe a little older and dangerous. And all these buildings have been cleaned up and, you know, cool, hip, young people, for the most part anyway, that's gentrification, has that undertone, have kind of moved in. So again, true or false, gentrification causes values to decrease? False. Highest and best use is a term you might want to write, actually, right next to highest and best use. You might want to write 3 words. I'd write the words greatest net return. Highest and best use is the use of a property that would produce the greatest net return over time. So watch, I'll give you a quick example of this. For highest and best use, let's say that you had an office building. And the office building is in an area where there are way too many office buildings. And then, by the way, you're going to see this. I suspect you'll see this in a post-COVID world if work from home tends to be a permanent thing for society. You might see a bunch of office buildings that are just sitting vacant. The question is, well, they're not making us enough money sitting vacant. So what do we do with the office buildings to produce the greatest net return? A lot of shopping malls that have been abandoned are going to face this same question. What do we do with all these office buildings? Because people are shopping online and on Amazon and all this sort of thing. You're going to have millions of square feet. In fact, right now, if you Google abandoned office malls, or if you go to Instagram and search #abandoned mall, you'll see dozens of malls all across our country that have basically been abandoned. The question is, what do we do with all that space? How do we repurpose it for its highest and best use? So the first question about highest and best use is, what use is going to produce the greatest net return over time? That's highest and best use. But it's also got to be physically possible and legally permissible. So yes, we'd make a lot more money selling drugs out of an office building than we would selling real estate. But an appraiser would never show up and say, hey, the highest and best use is a meth lab. Why? Because clearly it's not legal. It's not physically possible. So again, two questions about highest and best use on the test. First, the greatest net return resulting from a piece of real estate is its highest and best use. The most profitable, physically possible, and legally permissible use of a piece of real estate is, again, its highest and best use. Now, one more slide, and I want to take any questions you might have. First, you'll see the term conformity 383 in the 11th edition. So you probably have heard this term before, if things conform. What does conform mean? Well, it means everything's kind of the same. So imagine you have an 8,000 square foot home. How do you want your neighbor's house to look? Well, about 8,000 square feet too, or bigger. You don't want an 8,000 square foot home next to a 1,200 square foot home, next to a gas station, next to a vacant lot. You want everything to kind of look the same. That's why conformity, where everything's kind of the same, conformity tends to stabilize value on page 407 or 383. Now, related to conformity, there are two words that we need to know for the test. The first, of course, is progression. The next is regression. Progression and regression. Now, you don't need to take a real estate exam to know this. You're going to know what these mean. Progression just sounds good. Sounds like pro or progress. Regression just sounds bad. Regression sounds like regress or pull back. So progression is, and you might want to make a little note of this, progression is where you have a beat up home around nicer ones. Regression is where you have a beautiful home around a bunch of kind of crappy homes. So progression says, and this is what you want, obviously progression, hence the term pro or progress. Progression is what you want. Progression says, if you have a 3-bedroom home in a 7-bedroom neighborhood, the value of your 3-bedroom home is going to increase. Regression says, if you have a 5-bedroom home around a bunch of 3-bedroom homes, the value of your 5-bedroom home is going to go down. So my question is, would you rather have the smallest house in the best area, or would you rather have the biggest home in the worst area? You're going to want the smallest house in Beverly Hills. You're going to want the smallest house in Newport Coast, because the value of the neighborhood and all the surrounding homes are going to bring up your house's value. That's an example of progression. You don't necessarily want the nicest house in the worst area, because the area and the surrounding homes are going to bring that nice home down. Again, you know this already. You don't need to get a real estate license to know this, but here's the question you might find on the test. By which appraisal principle will the value of a smaller home be positively impacted if surrounding homes are of greater value? Progression. Now, the last two things here, then I'll take any questions you might have: contribution and competition. Now, contribution says, will a swimming pool be worth it? Contribution says, will a swimming pool be worth it? Now, whether the answer is yes or no isn't the point. The appraiser is looking at, if I look at a home and I put on a new roof, what effect will this have to the value? If I'm appraising a home and I add a new swimming pool, what effect will this have on the value? The appraisal principle that examines that is contribution. So again, question on the test might say, the owner of a 16-unit apartment building wants to know, if she adds a pool, will this impact the value of her home? The appraisal principle is what? Contribution. Now, the last one that I want to take any questions you have is competition. Competition is just another word for supply. How many homes are competing with your listing? There are very few homes on the market. The inventory is tight. If a neighborhood, like we have one office in a city called Rancho Cucamonga normally has between 300 and 350 homes for sale in like a normal market. That's about a 6-month supply of homes in Cucamonga. Right now, there's about 130 homes for sale in Cucamonga. There's less competition, meaning what happens to prices? Prices go up. By the way, you combine very low inventory like we have now with a combination of super low interest rates and high demand, you get prices going through the roof, which is basically what's happened to prices. You know this already, even in the car business. You know that there's a chip shortage. There's a lot of new car dealers don't have stock. What's happened to the values of a lot of used cars? Well, if I need a car, I can't buy a new one so much right now. I'm going to have to buy a used one. Everybody's flocked to the used car market because there's not a lot of competition, right, for supply of cars. Prices go through the roof. Now, the greater the supply, the more competition there is. What happens to value? Values, of course, go down. The more supply there is, the less supply, values go up. Any questions about any of this so far? Please feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question about any of this, please. Okay, cool. We'll jump right back into the deck here then. I want to respect your time and keep your day moving. So let's just do a quick 5-question review though. Number 1, how long is an appraisal valid for?
1 day.
1 day.
Right? 1 day only. Excellent. An appraiser is asked to appraise a commercial property with an estimated value of $550,000. What license do they need?
Certified general.
Excellent. They do a certified general license. True or false? An appraisal is a written guarantee of what a property will sell for.
False.
False. It's just an estimate or opinion of value. Between market value, subjective value, or assessed value, what is the goal of an appraisal?
Market value.
Market value. The greatest net return resulting from a piece of real estate is its what? The greatest net return. Highest
and best use.
There you go. Highest and best use. Remember, what are we going to do with our abandoned office building? What are we going to do with our abandoned shopping malls, right? That's a highest and best use question. 2 last ones. A 3-bedroom home in a neighborhood of 7-bedroom mansions benefits from what?
Russia.
Progression. Benefits from progression. A 6-bedroom home in a neighborhood of 2-bedroom condos suffers from what?
Regression.
Regression, right? Suffers from regression. Now, I want to show you a couple of other things here where it says life cycle of real estate, 384 in the 11th edition. So every neighborhood goes through 4 stages. The 4 stages are growth, equilibrium, decline, and revitalization. Growth, equilibrium, decline, and revitalization. So first, let's start with growth. Growth is where you have an area of super old homes or super abandoned lots, I should say, not old homes. You have a bunch of abandoned lots where you have a bunch of raw land or an area that never was built on, and you have a bunch of new construction happening. Now, Beverly Hills is not in growth. There's not a lot of vacant tracts of raw land in Beverly Hills. Everything's built on. So we know Beverly Hills is not in growth. A city like Irvine is in growth. The Irvine company has deliberately built houses in sprints, and there's still raw land that they're developing in Irvine. Mission Viejo was in growth in the late 90s, early 2000s. I have to use like Orange County or inland examples because there's not a lot of coastal areas that are in growth right now because, you know, a lot of the most desirable coastal areas have been built on. But then you have equilibrium where houses are built, people are taking care of their homes, the area is in equilibrium. Decline is the next stage where eventually people will start neglecting their homes, original owners move out, people that don't care as much move in, and eventually an area over time might end up with a little bit of blight. Blight is just a term for a bad or kind of rundown area. But eventually what will happen? Eventually, over time, people will start moving in. The prices will be so low that people can afford to buy those homes, fix them up, and the area might become gentrified. So again, every neighborhood is going to go through 4 stages eventually. They'll go through growth, where the land gets developed, equilibrium, where people move in and take care of their homes, decline over time, and then revitalization. So again, knowing where a particular neighborhood is in any of these stages, and again, you might find pockets of each of these in certain communities. You might find pockets like in Santa Ana, for example. You might find pockets of revitalization, but you might have other pockets of decline. So you might find pockets of these in every neighborhood. But again, these are the 4 stages in the life cycle of real estate. Now, I want to talk about a couple last things. 384 in the 11th edition, you'll see 2 terms that are super important for the test. The 2 terms are anticipation and substitution. Now, first, next to anticipation, I would write the words expectation of value increase. Anticipation is an expectation of value increase. By the way, how many people right now are buying real estate expecting the values to go up? A lot. A lot of people are buying real estate now saying, hey, the market's gone up 25, 30% during COVID. It's probably going to, I'm not saying they're right. Market's going to continue to rise, and people are buying homes expecting value increase. That's called anticipation. Now, so if the question on the exam were to say, the Smith family is looking forward to retiring on the profit they'll make from selling their home, their attitude is an example of what? Anticipation, right? Anticipation as an expectation of value increase. The other term here is substitution. This is the last term, and I wish it wasn't the last term because it's the most important one in the whole chapter, substitution. So first thing you might want to write next to substitution, I would write the words, no prudent person would pay more. Substitution says no prudent person. Now, what's a prudent person? A reasonable person, a sane, intelligent person. No sane person would pay more. Now, I'll give you an example of it. Imagine you're looking at 2 houses next to each other, and they're both pretty much the same. One house is for sale for $800,000. Another house is for sale for $750,000. Assuming they're mostly alike, which one are you probably going to buy? Well, the one for $750,000, right? No intelligent person is going to pay $50,000 more for something that is substantially similar to the house next door to it. So first, substitution says no prudent person would pay more, number 1. Number 2, I would also write the words most residential real estate valued. Most residential real estate is going to be valued on this concept of substitution. Obviously, if you want to know what your house is worth, what do? Well, you look at what another home like yours recently sold for, and that tells you probably about what your house is worth. So that's substitution. Substitution says my house is worth what another house like mine sold for. Now, not every piece of real estate is valued this way. The White House is not going to be valued on substitution. Why? Because there's no other White House that sold recently. Michael Jackson's house is not going to be valued on substitution. Why? Because there's nothing like the Neverland Ranch that sells with regularity. The Getty Museum is not going to be valued on substitution. But my 3-bedroom home in Culver City, yeah, that's valued on substitution. I look at what another 3-bedroom home kind of like mine sold for, and that's basically going to determine the value of my home. So 2 questions on the test. First, the basis for most residential appraisals is what? Substitution, number 1. Number 2, by which appraisal principle would the value of one home set the value for another? Substitution. Any questions about this at all? So jumping right back into the deck here, there are 3 ways to conduct an appraisal. So if an appraiser gets an appraisal assignment, there are basically, on page 386 in the 11th edition, there are basically only 3 ways that the appraisal can be conducted. The three ways are the market data approach, the sales comparison approach is a synonym for that, the cost approach, and the income approach. So no matter what kind of property you're looking at, there are only three ways to conduct the appraisal. Those three ways are the sales comparison approach, the cost approach, and of course, the income approach to appraisal. Now, you don't need to be a real estate expert at this point to kind of guess what these mean. In the market data or sales comparison approach, what does it just sound like we're looking at to determine value? What does it just sound like we're looking at? Comps, right? We're looking at comps to determine value. We're looking at what another home like mine recently sold for, and this determines the value of my house. In the cost approach, what does it sound like we're looking at in the cost approach? It sounds like we're looking at the cost to what? Rebuild the thing. We're looking at the cost to rebuild the thing. And then, of course, the income approach to appraisal. In the income approach, what does it look like? What does it sound like we're looking at in the income approach? We're looking at the income that the property produces. The more income that the property makes, the more value the property has. So again, no matter what appraisal you're looking at, there are three ways to do it: the market data approach, the cost approach, and the income approach. Let's start with the sales comparison approach on 411, 387 in the 11th edition. Most of us are going to be on 411. Now, in the sales comparison approach, this is going to work well with single-family homes. It's going to work well with condos. It's going to work well with mobile homes. It's going to work well on raw land. It's not going to work well on the Getty Museum. It's not going to work well on the White House or the Capitol building. It's only going to work well on other properties that have readily accessible comparable sales. This is based on substitution. So by the way, one thing you might want to write next to sales comparison approach, I'd write three words. I'd write the words easiest to learn. The sales comparison approach is the easiest approach to learn. And I'd also write the words most frequently used. The sales comparison approach is the easiest approach to learn and the most frequently used for an appraisal. Now, here's a quick question for you about the sales comparison approach. How frequently do you think real estate agents, because we've been talking about appraisers this whole time, how frequently do you think appraisers use this approach? And realtors, all the time. Somebody says, hey, I want to know what my house is worth. Great, we look at the comps. An appraiser is assigned by a bank to appraise a property for a refinance. Same thing. You're going to have the sales comparison approach most often invoked. But Mr. Singh asked an interesting question. His question was, well, what if I fixed up my house a little bit? What if my house has a better view than the house next door? What if my house maybe has an extra bedroom or an extra bathroom, or I have marble flooring and the other house had carpet? Shouldn't my house be worth a little more in that context? And yeah, it will. The way we reconcile that is through a concept called adjusting. And you'll see this on page 411, 387 in the 11th edition, the concept of adjusting. So the comparable sale sold for 1.5 million with no ocean view. My house has an ocean view. So again, this is not complicated. I want to know what my house is worth. The house next door sold for $1.5 million with no ocean view. My house has an ocean view. What do we do? Well, is my house with an ocean view worth more or worth less than the house without an ocean view?
More.
I hope you know this already. It's going to be worth more, right? Because I have an ocean view and the other person's looking at the street. So fine, my house is probably worth more. The question is, how much more? How do we figure out, what do you think we do as a real estate agent or appraiser? What do we do to figure out how much this ocean view is worth? And how often,
compared to,
by the way, how often do you think there are these subtle differences? All the time. And by the way, one thing before I let you go is, how often do you think a real estate agent goes to a guy's house that wants to list it and says, but my house is nicer. I just put on a new roof. I have solar. I have a pool. My backyard's better. That house smelled funny. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons why your seller is going to think their house is worth 10 times more than the neighbor's. So how do we figure out, how do we quantify what that adjustment amount is?
can you compare to other homes with ocean views that have been sold in the area?
Correct. Exactly. That's exactly right. You look at, you try, there is a blend of art and science to this. You're not going to get it right all the time. The appraiser has to try to isolate a value of that view and then adjust. And Andy asks, is it a line item? It is, right, in the appraisal. It is a line item in the appraisal. You basically try to estimate a value for the view. And by the way, if it's not a view, if it's a pool, the question is not how much did the pool cost? Because how much the pool cost has no relationship to what it's worth. What something cost had no relationship to what it's worth. In fact, in life, that's completely true. I mean, what something cost versus what it's worth, there's hardly ever a relationship. I'll give you an example. You paid $500 for this class. That's what it cost. If you sell one house ever, you'll get literally 15 times, 20 times your money back. What this cost is irrelevant to what it's worth. You go to a doctor and your doctor finds some problem with your body. The doctor's appointment costs you $200. What's that diagnosis worth? Well, a lot more than the $200, right? So the point is, you don't look at, for the pool, you don't look at what the pool cost. You look at what the pool's worth. What the pool cost might be $50,000. What it's worth might be $30,000, or it could be $80,000, right? It's going to be neighborhood specific. So right next to adjusting on 411, 387 in the 11th edition, right next to adjusting, you might want to write, you'll see this formula on that page. You might want to write the words most difficult part of market data approach. The most difficult part of this approach is not in selecting the comps. The most difficult part is in adjusting for the differences between the subject property and the comparable sale, right? The most difficult part is adjusting for the differences between the subject and the comparable. So I want to just quickly review this. There are three ways to conduct an appraisal: market data approach, also called the sales comparison approach, the cost approach, and the income approach. In the market data approach, what are we doing? We're looking at comps. We're looking at comparable sales to determine what the property is worth. There's another approach when you don't have any comps. When you are looking at like the White House, 390 in the 11th edition. When you're looking at the White House, a beautiful church, temple, mosque, synagogue, pick the religion, it doesn't even matter. A lot of these religious structures literally have some of the most beautiful architecture humanity has ever conceived of. They're gorgeous. But if you want to find out what a beautiful Catholic church is worth, you don't look at the market data approach. Why? Because there's not another 35,000 square foot, chapel that recently sold around the corner. So, or you're looking at the White House. This is not going to work with the market data approach. You're going to have to use the cost approach to appraisal. So right next to cost approach on 414, 390 in the 11th edition, you might want to write the words highly unique properties. This approach is invoked when you have highly unique properties like churches, temples, synagogues, mosques, cathedrals, libraries, police stations, fire stations. Now, how does this approach work? You'll see this formula here on 414, 390 in the 11th edition. You'll see this formula. You get the reproduction cost minus depreciation plus the land. That gives you the value on the cost approach. So as an example, let's say I'm an appraiser and I'm appraising a 1,000 square foot property. Now, how do I know it's 1,000 square feet? Well, I can measure it. I measure the site and it's 1,000 square feet. Let's say it cost us $100 per square foot to build it. Now it's more than that, but just for my example, I'm going to use 1,000 square foot property at 100 a foot. Now, how does the appraiser know how much it actually costs to build? The appraiser looks at something called a cost manual. And the cost manual that basically everyone uses, I'm sharing my screen here, is software called Marshall Swift. Marshall Swift basically looks at lumber cost, concrete cost, PVC pipe, insulation, Cat 6 cable, roofing material. And the appraiser reads the cost manual and estimates the cost on a per square foot basis. So that's how we get the cost to build. We take the size of the property times the cost per square foot. How do we get the cost per square foot? We look at a Marshall Swift cost manual. Let's say it's $100 a square foot, step one. Step two, you subtract out depreciation. Now, what is depreciation? Depreciation is a loss in value. Basically, in this context, this is physical wear and tear on the property. So the appraiser looks around the property and determines how much work the property needs. Is there a leaky roof? Is there messed up plumbing? Is there a foundation that needs to be repaired? Let's say there's $20,000 in depreciation. So now the building is going to cost us $100,000 minus $20,000 in depreciation. Great. The depreciated building is worth $80,000. The last step is the appraiser determines the value of the land using land comps or land extraction. And we say it's $80,000 for the structure plus $300,000 for the land. The building is worth $380,000. So the cost approach looks at what would it cost to rebuild the structure in its current state. So we look at our cost manual to get brand new construction. We subtract out the depreciation. Now watch, the depreciation again is like how much wear and tear is there on the property. Here's a question for you. How much depreciation do you think there is at the White House? How much like wear and tear and broken items do you think there are in the White House? I mean, just a gut check. I know none of us live there, but how much wear and tear do you think there is in the White House? Probably very little.
None.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe none, right? Why? Because the White House is meticulously maintained by historians, engineers, and full-time contractors. So the minute something scratches, breaks, or dents, they restore it to its original condition, take pictures of what they did and who broke it, and there you go. So the White House is probably not going to have very much depreciation. How much depreciation do you think there is in a termite-infested shack in the middle of the desert? Okay, more, right? So there's going to be more depreciation on a deal like that. So by the way, what just sounds easier to you, the market data approach or the cost approach? The market data approach going to be way easier. Why? Because all you're doing in the market data approach is pulling comps and adjusting. In the cost approach, you have all sorts of things you could get wrong. Reproduction costs you could get wrong. Depreciation you can get wrong. The land value you can mess up. So you don't want to use the cost approach. You only use the cost approach when you have to. When do you have to use the cost approach? When there are no comps and there is no income, like the White House, like a church, like a temple, right? You're kind of stuck in the cost approach. Now, even if you don't know what obsolescence is, does it sound good or bad? Just sounds bad, right? It sounds like obsolete. It sounds bad. 392 and 393 in the 11th edition. I'll change this here. This is 393. Now, there's two types of obsolescence. There's functional obsolescence, and then there's economic or external obsolescence. Now, let me share with you the difference. So functional obsolescence are going to be problems that exist inside the property line. Economic or external obsolescence is outside the property line. Economic or external obsolescence is outside the property line. Next to functional, by the way, I would write the words usually curable. Functional obsolescence is usually curable. Economic or external obsolescence is outside the property line and generally incurable. Now, I'll give you an example of this here. So first, functional obsolescence is where you have a house in Palm Springs with no air conditioning. A house in Palm Springs with no air conditioning is going to suffer from functional obsolescence. Why? Because there's no air conditioning. That's a problem inside the property line. Is that curable or incurable? Curable. You can pay to put a new air conditioning system in. 6-bedroom, 1-bathroom home. Functional obsolescence. Curable or incurable? You could add another bathroom or more bathrooms. That's curable. How about economic or external? Watch. The house backs up to an active freight railroad track. Okay, that's external. Curable or incurable?
Incurable.
Incurable. The house is adjacent to the flight pattern of a local airport. External. Curable or incurable to get rid of the airport?
Incurable.
Incurable. You get the idea, right? So obsolescence is anything that could affect the value of the property. If there's a problem inside the property line, it's going to be functional. If it's outside the property line, it's going to be external or economic. Which one's generally curable? Functional. Which one's generally incurable? External or economic. Now, the last approach is the income approach. And in the income approach, remember, there's only 3 ways to conduct an appraisal. There's the sales comparison approach, there's the cost approach, and there's the income approach. In the sales comparison approach, we're looking at comps. In the cost approach, we're looking at the cost to construct. In the income approach, we're looking at the income that the property produces. 395 in the 11th edition. I think we can all agree the more income that a property produces, the more valuable a property is. The higher the income, the higher the value. Now, I'll give you an example of this. Imagine a 200-unit building in Long Beach that was illegal to rent out. How valuable is a 200-unit apartment building that the city has made illegal to rent out? Well, it's basically worthless. You can't do anything with it. So because that property produces no income, the property has no value. So the higher the income, the higher the value. Now, I know a lot of you guys kind of shut down when you see even the slightest bit of math. Don't do that here because it's actually quite simple. All you're doing is you are dividing one number by another. You are dividing the annual net income by some capitalization rate. You're dividing some annual net income by some capitalization rate. So let me explain what I mean by that. So watch, the top number is the annual net income. Now, what is the annual net income? Basically, that's the gross income minus expenses. The gross income minus expenses. And the capitalization rate is the investor's anticipated rate of return. The capitalization rate is the investor's anticipated rate of return. Now, obviously, you know, the higher the risk, the higher the rate of return. Like, I'll give you an example of this. How risky is it to leave your money in the bank in a checking account? It's not risky. The bank is not going to go under. You're generally FDIC insured. There is very little risk in leaving your money in the bank. So how much interest does the bank pay you on leaving your money in the bank? Well, they don't really pay you too much. They pay you basically nothing. But we are okay as a society getting very little interest on our checking account deposits because how risky is it? Well, it's not risky. So if you were to invest in a stock market, or you were to invest in crypto, or you were to invest in something else that's a little riskier, you're going to want more than what the bank is willing to pay you because you're taking on some extra risk. So the bottom number is the capitalization rate, which is the investor's anticipated rate of return that is supposed to point to some measure of risk. So I'll give you an example. So watch. How do we figure out the value of a property using the income approach? You take the annual net income and you divide it by what? Some cap rate. What is the annual net income? That's the gross income minus expenses. The cap rate is the investor's anticipated rate of return. Let me give you an example of this here. I'll give you 3 commercial tenants: Radio Shack, Nordstrom, and Starbucks. Now, what would you say is the safest of all of these tenants? Meaning, which tenant is least likely to default on the rent and which tenant is most likely to stay in the space? Well, Starbucks is probably the safest. Now, Nordstrom is super safe too, but remember, Nordstrom actually closed a couple dozen locations at the start of COVID. In fact, the 2 near our office closed, the one in Montclair and I think the one in Riverside, both ended up closing. So Nordstrom is safe. I mean, it's $1 billion company, but Starbucks is probably a little safer. Radio Shack is crazy, right? Radio Shack is probably, if there probably aren't even any left, but if they are, I don't know how much money you're going to make selling batteries to people out of 2,000 square feet of retail space. So Radio Shack is probably the riskiest. So notice, each one of these tenants pays $100,000 in net income. Radio Shack, an investor might want a 10% rate of return at Radio Shack because it's so risky. That building is worth $1 million. Nordstrom is safer. So Nordstrom, you probably want a 5 cap. That building is worth $2 million. Starbucks, you might say on Starbucks, hey, Starbucks is super safe. So Starbucks, I'm fine with only a 4% rate of return. It's better than the bank. It's still real estate. I got a great tenant. Notice if you take 100,000 and you divide it by 4%, it's worth $2.5 million. So notice what's happening. The riskier the tenant, the higher the cap rate. The higher the cap rate, the lower the value. The cap rate gets low, the value goes high. What makes the cap rate low? The safety of the tenant. So in the income approach, you don't really necessarily care as much like where the property is or how nice the property is. In the income approach, all you care about is how much is the tenant paying, that's the top number, and how safe is the tenant, that's reflective in the bottom number. The riskier the tenant is, the more rate of return you're going to want, and the value of the property is going to go down. It's just math. 100,000. Now, here, by the way, here's how you could flip commercial real estate. Let's say you had a Radio Shack as a tenant. Their lease is up and they exit. Now the space is empty. You lease it to Starbucks. Notice what happened. All of a sudden, the value of your property doubled. You didn't move it. You didn't fix it up. You didn't put new carpet and paint on it like a residential flip. All you're doing in the income approach is you're leasing it to a more stable, more reliable tenant, and the market automatically views that property as less risk. So the value automatically increases because the cap rate is low. So notice there are 3 ways to conduct an appraisal: market data approach, cost approach, and income approach. I'm appraising a 200-unit apartment building. What approach am I probably going to use? Income. A 200-unit apartment building, that's all about the income. I'm appraising a 4-bedroom home in LA. What am I probably going to use? Market data approach. I'm going to look at substitution and look at what other 4-bedroom homes in LA have sold for. I'm appraising a church or a government building with no comps. What approach am I probably going to use? The cost approach. I'm appraising Michael Jackson's house. What am I probably going to use?
Cost approach.
Cost approach. Why? Because there's no income and there aren't any comps. Any questions about any of these at all? Now, the last 2 things I have, 398 in the 11th edition, the final step in the appraisal process is called reconciliation. Reconciliation is where the appraiser meditates on the 3 approaches and chooses which one she thinks is most relevant. If it's a house, we're probably going to reconcile to the market data approach. If it's a unique property, we're going to reconcile to the cost approach. If it's a shopping center, we're probably going to reconcile in the final step to the income approach. And finally, if you look at page 399 in the 11th edition, you'll notice that there are 3 appraisal reports. Appraisals are always written. There are no oral appraisal reports. They're always written. The one that we need to know the most here on 399 in the 11th edition is the self-contained report. This is also called the narrative report. And right next to this, I'd write the words most comprehensive and complete. The self-contained report, also called the narrative report, is the most comprehensive and complete method of conveying the results of an appraisal. That's the self-contained or narrative report. So if the question on the exam were to say, the appraisal report with the most comps, with the most pictures, the most data is going to be the what again? Self-contained, also called the narrative appraisal report.